So, just to introduce myself, Gretel Evans. I'm an accredited conservator, restorer, and I manage the conservation department at AOC Archaeology. We're located outside of Edinburgh. We also have 6 offices geographically spanning from Inverness to London. So we conserve archaeological material from all our offices and also other units, north and south of the Scottish border, and even occasionally from Wales. So today I'm going to talk about the conservation process, and this is in the commercial archaeology setting. I'm going to explain what happens at the different stages, assessment through to analysis, and also look at what can be done prior to those stages in the field to achieve the best results and maximise on budgets. So the themes running through all these 3 stages are collaboration with relevant specialists, the importance of communication, as not everyone is familiar with conservation, its aims and what it can achieve, and also coaching or training, but training isn't so alliterative. Coaching of colleagues, how we as conservators can help shape the future of the archaeological profession. And just out of interest, do we have any conservators here today in the audience? No, that's fine. Wasn't expecting. Oh, sorry. Thank you. So for those of you who are not conservators, do you have in-house conservators that you have access to or conservation services that you regularly use? I know you do. It's interesting just to see how many people have that aspect. Obviously, we're kind of spoiled at AOC, and some of the other units like York Archaeology, etc., have that in-house specialism. But I appreciate not everybody does, and that's what this is about, to explain the process more. So why conserve? One answer is to get from this to this, which I hope you all agree is an improvement. It's to stabilise artefacts, that's why we conserve. Objects continue to decay, as Phil has mentioned, particularly after excavation due to changes in environment and oxygen mainly, as Lisa has said. And even after treatment, they continue to decay as well. Conservation materials have a lifespan, so it's not the end of the road. We're also looking to extract archaeological information. That's a really important aspect of the conservation. So that's information on manufacture, use, provenance, and all this information will advance knowledge and aid interpretation of archaeological sites and past civilizations. And it's also to preserve the artifact, not only for future display, for example, in a museum environment, but also for future analysis when there are improved techniques available. And this object here is a Forteviot dagger, if anyone's interested. Came out of a block lift of a material from a grave. So the first aim in carrying out this initial conservation post-excavation will endeavour to stabilise artefacts for archive. And there's just a little excerpt there about the importance and the onus on archaeologists to conserve and stabilise things for archive. So conservation requirements will vary depending on material type, but for example, metals need to be made stable so that they're not actively corroding, and for some this may mean chemical or mechanical treatment. For others it can be done passively. Waterlogged or damp organic material must be dried in such a way so as not to cause further degradation, and this may mean treatment with polyethylene glycol and vacuum freeze drying. And some treatments may preclude or inhibit further scientific analysis. So the investigation of artifacts during stabilisation treatment is of the utmost importance so as not to lose information or preclude its extraction at a further date. And cleaning is destructive. I'm just finding that. Is it always scrolling down through the notes, guys at the back? Thank you. So cleaning is destructive. Corrosion can hold a huge amount of archaeological information, from mineralized organic materials to the use and history of an object during its lifetime and after. Thanks. At this stage, we're conserving for stability, but further conservation work may be undertaken after the archive of the assemblage, either for further study purposes or to enable objects to be interpreted for display. So the conservation process at AOC, and this is the way we like to do things, it doesn't always necessarily happen, but this is the ideal process we have. And that involves collaboration between conservators and find specialists. The first stage is X-radiography. That's for metals, obviously, but we also X-ray other metals where it's of merit, and I'll touch on that later. But for example, black lithics, which may aid the identification of them at a later stage, bone combs and other materials as well, such as jet beads. So X-radiography is carried out by conservators, and these X-radiographs are required by find specialists to enable their assessment of artifacts. You can't do it well without them. Conservation assessment of the artifacts will ensure that find specialist recommendations for the further work are taken into account. So that may be them recommending in further investigation or meriting stabilisation or full conservation if that's feasible. And conservators will make recommendations for the treatment of the assemblage to ensure that all finds are stable for archive. So we're kind of coming together there on the post-ex assessment. And costs of treatment are estimated at this assessment stage and given to the client or project manager for approval to proceed. And the costs for assessment are estimated based on what you have to assess, how much material there is, material types, whether it's X-radiography or not. So X-radiography, why is it necessary? Well, it helps us to do this: identify artifacts. It's an archive standard and an absolutely minimum one. It provides a permanent record of artifacts post-excavation, which is why it should be happening early on too and not years later. It assists with analysis, identifying, for example, as I've mentioned, black lithics in conjunction with XRF, or the construction of bone combs, or if you ever have any lovely jet spacer beads, you can wonderfully see the drill holes through them. And it's very much needed for conservation treatment. So when we're cleaning, for example, maybe air braiding an iron object, it shows us where the artifact kind of starts and the corrosion stops, or vice versa, so that we basically remove the corrosion and leave the artifact there. So when we're doing a conservation assessment, we're looking at the condition of the material, what is the material type, and going back to Morgan's talk there, to make informed treatment recommendations based on the objects being retained for archive. Find specialist recommendations are imperative at this stage. The significance of artifacts will help focus conservation work and budgets in the right place. We can produce priorities for conservation, which is helpful when budgets are tight, as are informed retention and discard decisions from find specialists so that we don't waste resources. Every object is examined for its own merits. There are no recipes in conservation. And we may be able to provide options in terms of conservation treatments while still achieving stability for the archive. And treatment recommendations can take budgets into account. For example, if they're tight, passive stabilisation might be available for some metal types. We may be able to target areas of objects for investigative conservation rather than carrying out a full clean. And we can also prioritise work on more significant artefacts once they're highlighted by the find specialists. And then we get to the conservation treatment stage. Artifacts are made stable for archive, and all documentation that is produced through the conservation process should also form that part of the future archive. However, that's by no means the end of conservation for some artifacts, as further conservation may be undertaken for research or display in a museum or other environment. So just going back to the identification here from X-rays and how important it is. At AOC, we advocate for X-radiography of all metals, except lead, obviously, and some may be industrial or modern artifacts, which are not necessary. And although some do like to select what they think are the more interesting or pertinent finds for X-radiography, you never know what you might be missing, and that's why we advocate X-raying the whole assemblage. So, for example, at the top there, we've got some what was thought to be copper working waste, which actually turned out to be some nice wire. And then the originally identified iron strap below was in fact a Roman saw blade. So when budgets are tight, X-radiography of the assemblage should always be done as a minimum standard. Otherwise, we risk not identifying all artifacts correctly. And just to give a couple of examples of the archaeological information that can be revealed during the conservation process. So this up here is a spearhead. This is an adjoining part with a socket here. You may not see it too well, but trust me, there is a groove, a very defined groove in the corrosion there. And working with the fine specialist, it was determined that the diameter of the groove matches that of the remains of the wood in the socket. So what would have been the shaft? Obviously, the rest of the shaft has decayed over time. And by matching those up, we can deduce that the weapon has been deliberately broken prior to deposition in the grave. At some point, obviously, the wood has lain next to that spearhead, and as it's corroded, it's preserved its shape in the corrosion, but the rest of the wood has disappeared. And this informed the decision to keep the corrosion on the artifact, and actually we consolidated that groove, and it was very fragile, and that was also achieved because that object was lifted by special means, which I'll come on to in a short while. And then this one here, a nice penannular brooch, that's a rib bone. And if you can see just there, a kind of weave coming out in the iron corrosion. So that is where iron corrosion has minerally preserved the weave of the cloth that the brooch was attached to in the grave. And again, very fragile and could easily be lost. So again, retained. So that leads me on to the recovery of artifacts in the field and how important this initial stage is for information not to be lost. So we'll probably have some crossover here, Phil. Talked a lot about collaboration between fine specialists and conservators during post-excavation work, but communication between field teams and conservators prior to excavation is vital to yield good results in the field. Remember that artifacts deteriorate upon excavation immediately due to the change in environments. Ensure you are prepared for what you might expect to find and what you might not. So have adequate and appropriate packing materials to hand. Consult with a conservator on how to deal with possible finds given the location and type of excavation being undertaken, dry site, wet site, etc. And once on site, images can easily be relayed with today's smartphone technology to a conservator, and advice can be given over the phone. A picture is always worth 1,000 words. Take emergency lifting materials just in case. An awful lot can be done with some cling film and duct tape. And consider how you will safely transport any finds back to the office. As well as packing materials for the objects, take large boxes or crates and padding materials to safely transport finds long distances. And consider training manuals and guidance for new staff, and maybe old ones, and for fieldwork teams to follow on site. Excuse me. So onto the coaching or training, which for fieldwork teams could involve supporting them by familiarisation with a recovery policy and retention strategy, that way they know what to recover and what not to. CIFA provides some really great guidance documents and research frameworks, for example, the toolkit for selecting archaeological archives. Give them training in identification of materials. This ensures that correct processes are followed. For example, materials that require X-radiography, like iron, are highlighted at the initial stage, as opposed to something which is slag, which might not need it. And they can be sometimes a little bit confusing to tell the difference between. So, little classes and identification. It will save time at the post-ex stage, which saves more money. Safe handling of finds is a must to prevent loss of information, such as that retained in corrosion products, and make all efforts, please, to avoid cleaning artifacts in the field. You can be removing an absolute wealth of information. Correct packing of finds will prevent deterioration of artifacts and loss of information. So packing wet organics so that they stay wet. That may mean double bagging, either with a wet soil or adding water to it. And in terms of recording processes, ensure finds are clearly labelled, permanent markers, good kind of quality finds bags with a writing strip, and that subsequently site information is available to post-ex teams. Give fieldwork teams guidance on when to call a conservator for advice or help. What can they safely manage and what is beyond their current experience? And also ensure that they know the correct processes for finds on return to the office. What is the process for highlighting fragile and vulnerable material for additional care? Does wet or damp material need cold storage to prevent deterioration? And who do they contact to facilitate this? And that brings me on to training in lifting techniques to aid safe recovery of finds. Consider investing time and skills in training interested fieldwork colleagues in more specialised lifting techniques. And I say interested because not everybody is interested in finds, but so that there is someone on site with advanced knowledge, particularly where there is no conservation staff to fall back on. So much more archaeological information can be retrieved if more objects are lifted in this way when needed. So these basic materials, obviously I've little diagram of wrapping up ceramic in situ there. But these basic materials, which are quite cheap, you can do an awful lot. Cling film, tin foil, that is plaster bandage, not toilet roll, and some duct tape. And finally, how do you find a conservator? Apart from obviously there's a few here today. ICON, Institute of Conservation, is our UK national body, but it's not just for archaeological specialisms, it's all disciplines. They hold a conservation register of accredited conservator restorers. And an ACR has demonstrated that they adhere to ICON's professional standards and ethics, so I do advise you seek that. And make sure you get someone with archaeological experience. Or alternatively, you're welcome to contact me at AOC. Thank you.